the two are pretty well intertwined. In other words, I am what I believe. I'm a Christian, a follower of Jesus Christ. My goal, if you will, is to love Him in everything that I do, my relationship with Mary, my relationship with kids, relationship with money, all flows out of that relationship to Christ. When I was about 2 weeks old, that's when I was baptized. And baptism is a sign and seal belonging to Christ. So not yet. Christianity to me is not primarily a theological enterprise. It's much more a matter of the heart. And I grew up in a Christian family. One of the early prayers I learned was, a one-sentence prayer before meal and another sentence before jumping in bed. And so that the presence of Christ was never something I doubted. What's the old expression? To decide to belong to Christ would be like if I was 12 years old and told my parents I decided to join the family, Yeah, I'm just reading this book on economics and philosophy, Mind and the Matter, where Voltaire and many of the others, personal happiness was the goal. And I think that's true for Christians. I grew up learning the Heidelberg Catechism. And the second question is, what three things do you need to know in order to live and die happily? Just like our U.S. Declaration of Independence, we've got a right to happiness. And Christianity, in a sense, has been my happiness. I was born in the midst of the so-called Great Depression. That influenced much of my early life. My father was employed, whereas a number of my school friends, their fathers were not employed. And we had a home. My parents had bought it for, $4,000 some years before. But I have a sister, an older sister, who died 2 weeks ago. She was 97. And like schooling, I went to a Christian elementary school. That was about 3-4 blocks from our house, and school buses hadn't been invented yet. Kindergarten hadn't either, but if you were 5 years old and you could tie your shoes, you could go to first grade. But I held my sister's hands to and from school walking, and we also came home for lunch. And One of the things I thought about the other day, and you wonder, why do these things stick in your mind? On rare occasion, my mother was doing something else. She would pack a lunch. And in the Depression, you didn't waste money on wax paper, so our sandwiches were wrapped in the Chicago Tribune. And when you unwrapped them at noontime, the print came off on the white bread. You wonder, why does that stick in your memory? My father came from a fairly large family, either 9 or 10, and his older sister was widowed. Her husband worked for the Monon Railroad, and the locomotive fell on him one day. And no workman's compensation or anything at that period of time. So, you know, they paid her for the day, and that was it. And so I knew also that our family, whatever limited income we had, part of it always went to Aunt Effie. It was the sharing of resources. And that was true to a fair extent of the Christian churches that we attended. There was always a collection for the poor, and there were always poor who needed it. Yeah, I never felt any particular need. I mean, we didn't have a car, we didn't have a telephone, a lot of that sort of stuff. But I remember we lived in suburban Chicago, and on Saturdays my mother would frequently give me 15 cents, and some other kid would get 15 cents from their mother. We could ride downtown to Chicago for a nickel on the streetcar and pay a nickel for a bottle of milk at the Field Museum. And we grew up learning every inch of the Field Museum in Chicago. But, my first meeting with dinosaurs and a few other things, but yes. Churches, from my perspective, are too costly. St. Paul reminded the Christians in one of his letters that he worked full-time and was not a financial burden to the church. Churches today invest staggering amounts of money in buildings. I never went to a church that had more than one pastor until we moved to Pittsburgh. I grew up in a fairly large church, I'd say 800 members. We had one pastor. Poor guy preached twice a Sunday, and once a week had all the kids into the church for catechetical instruction. But yeah, so that by necessity, for example, my parents were always able to pay my school tuition. Tuition has gone up. My mother graduated from a Christian elementary school, and she used to pay 10 cents a week in tuition. But Mary's parents were further down the economic ladder, and she graduated from a Christian school, and the church paid the tuition. the church I attended, if a family couldn't afford tuition, the church paid it. And so that, yeah, a redistribution of the goods was much more common. The brief answer is yes. Consumerism has greatly affected the American family. When I was a youngster growing up, I didn't know anybody whose mother was employed outside the home. Now it takes usually 2 incomes in order to maintain a American standard. So so there was much more time devoted to church activities, and in a sense, we didn't have TV, didn't have a telephone. If I wanted to talk to my friend George, you got on your bicycle and knocked on George's door and had a conversation, and got on the bike and went back home. So that visiting within the church of church family members was much more significant. I don't recall as a kid, there were very few weeks when there was not another family from our church in our home at some time or other. Yeah, part of it was growing up in an area just west of Chicago that was, you know, some people rented a house and some people owned the house, but the houses weren't much different. I never knew anybody who had 2 cars, never, you know, or a big house, or, you know, and as such, I mean, today if you have 6 kids, you need 6 bedrooms. I grew up in a family with 2 bedrooms. My father grew up in a family and never slept long ways in a bed until he was married. But that was not uncommon. So that there was much less, I think, of a comparison. There were fewer status symbols. There was fewer things that made you think you were more successful than the next guy. I had my first job when I was 11. My older sister, the Second World War was going on, and June wanted a bicycle. You couldn't get a bicycle because the tires were made of rubber and synthetic rubber didn't exist. So she decided to get a paper route and drafted me to go into the business with her. So the 2 of us delivered I think it was a twice weekly community newspaper. And we also collected, because I still remember we discovered if she collected, we got twice as much in tips than if I collected. And yeah, I did that when she was 2 years older. When she went to high school, I started delivering a daily newspaper. And I remember wanting to go to camp one summer. I must have been about 13, and my parents couldn't afford to send me to camp. Camp was in Michigan, and the fee was, I still remember, $16.25 for 2 weeks in camp. But my parents couldn't spend the 16 bucks. So I delivered newspapers, delivered the Chicago Daily News, and got 4 cents a month for each customer. And I had 100 customers, so I made $4 a month, and in 4.5 months I had enough money to go to camp. But as a family, I recall when my dad first got a week's vacation, and we used to rent a cabin at a conference ground owned by an outfit in Chicago called Moody Bible Institute on a lake in Indiana, and that was always a high point of the summer. Did too much reading and not enough studying. I have always been a voracious reader. I think that happened as little kids for birthdays or Christmas. Gifts were a book and new underwear. So we were always reading as kids. And I haven't, I was reading when you came in, I haven't stopped the habit. And I did a lot of reading in college, had an interest in Christianity. I had an experience when I outgrew the paper route in high school. I took a job in a restaurant downtown in Chicago. Got big money, 60 cents an hour, and it was in one of the tea rooms of one of the downtown department stores. And I worked Monday nights and Saturdays. When I got 60 cents an hour, and I had to pay the train fare from school to downtown and home again, and became infatuated with one of the waitresses. And we used to spend most of our money at a drugstore after work, talking about other things. She was a Catholic girl. I grew up in a family where the tail of the chicken was referred to as the Pope's nose. And in the church I attended, one of the confessional statements was referred to papal idolaters and cursed Anabaptists. You had to be a Calvinist or you were in trouble. And but Teresa didn't impress me as a cursed kid. And so long as I was downtown, I took a course in Catholicism from the one of the Catholic orders. I forget which one it was, which was sort of eye-opening to me. Found out that we both believed in the Nicene Creed and yada yada yada. And anyway, I parted ways with Teresa when I went to college, and read a number of books by Catholic authors. Then, one that made a big impression on me was a book by Thomas Merton, The Seven-Story Mountain, which was a description of his pilgrimage from lukewarm Protestantism to becoming a Cistercian monk. And his thoughts on lifestyle poverty, the call of Christians towards charity and poverty was very, very influential. I got married the day after college.
Where did you meet your wife?
In college. That was in May. It will be 73 years of marriage, but I knew her for 3 years before we got married, so we've been best friends for 75 years. I had a beach party. As I say, she looked very good in a bathing suit and arranged for a subsequent meeting, and the rest is history. So we got married. Speaking of economics, we had a $300 budget for a wedding and a honeymoon. And we got married in a small chapel, tea sandwiches for the reception, and we had rented for $40 for a week a cabin on a lake in the northern part of Michigan, and that's where we spent our honeymoon. Not too long, the Korean conflict was going on, and I had deferrals as long as I was in school. But I knew shortly thereafter I would be drafted. So we lived for a few months until August when I was drafted. We lived in Chicago. I had my most interesting job there. I needed a job and needed money, and knew a chap who was an architectural iron worker, and he was a journeyman. And what happens in these unions, if you're building something, you call the union hall, and the union hall sends over so many journeymen. And there was quite a bit of construction going on in Chicago, and they needed more iron workers, and so they called the union hall, and they would give people temporary cards as journeymen, which was a joke. Anyway, so I spent, it must have been about 6 weeks or something before I went to the military as a structural iron worker, and had bruises in my ribs the width of a girder. The first one we worked on was 39 stories, though. And one of my first jobs was to sit and put flashing around the roof. And these guys are nuts. They throw a couple 2x4s over, put a board, and put sandbags on the 2x4s and stand outside, and you'd look down. The first rule they ever taught me is never look up as a steel worker. Because if you look up, you see the clouds and you're apt to bend. That was advice I followed very carefully. Anyway, we got married and went to Fort Lewis, Washington. I'm always amazed at the Lord's providence. I did my basic infantry training there, and at about the time I think I was ready to get shipped over to Korea, the 2nd Infantry Division was being rotated back to the States, and Fort Lewis was their home base. And in one of their regiments, they needed a regimental pharmacist. To this day, when you get drafted, they assign you an MOS, Military Occupational Specialty, based upon your education and so forth. I think somebody read philosophy and put down pharmacy. Anyway, they told me I would be the pharmacist, and being in the infantry, I didn't want to confess to ignorance. I figured I could read a pill bottle as well as the next guy, and that worked out well because I spent the next 2 years as the Mary came out and we lived together in Olympia, Washington. That was an exercise in poverty. You're talking to a pacifist.
I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Parenthetically, I just finished reading a book called, are you a reader? A book called The Hornet's Nest, written by Jimmy Carter. I prize it because Jimmy Carter endorsed it for me. So we got a first edition presidentially signed book. But Carter describes the Revolutionary War in the South. And what he does is, it's a novel, historical novel you'd call it, and traces the lives of characters and the effect on war on their lives, physically, spiritually, what have you. And it's the only novel ever written by a president, the only one Jimmy ever wrote. But it explains, in a sense, his conviction on pacifism. Korean War, and to a subsequent, some years later, the Vietnam War, were fought ostensibly to stop communism. That coincided, the Korean conflict, with the McCarthy area, and communism was very bad. Back to the Army and college. In college, reading too much, I read Karl Marx's and Trotsky's books. And when I was in the Army, I found out if you could go to classes, and that made life easier. So I took a class and became the company's biological, chemical, and radiological warfare guru. And in order to get into the class, they did a security clearance, and found out when I was at Calvin that I had bought books from this communist books. They did let me in the class, but in terms of economics, and it makes a book like that interesting, because the fundamental question of macroeconomics is, who determines what piece of the pie? Yeah, we got out of the military. We had a beat-up car. We drove back to Chicago, sold it for $25, and my conscience has bothered me ever since. And in the good Lord's providence, 2 days later, I got on, we were staying with my parents, I got on what they call the elevated train in Chicago, went downtown, got off at Adams Street, went to the ground, and there was a building here and a building there. I went in that building. It said employment, 12th floor. I went up and they hired me. It happened to be the Continental Casualty Insurance Company, which was my first introduction to corporate finance. I only worked for the Continental for a couple years, and it dawned on me that companies paid much more for people who brought money into the company than people who sent it out. So I worked for them for a New York company for 30 years, marketing corporate investment programs. Because of employment, we moved from Chicago. While in Chicago, we built a house we were going to live in forever. Had a big fireplace in the kitchen and what have you. And 6 months later, I moved to Pittsburgh. But while we were in Chicago, we bought a summer home on a lake in Indiana. It was not pretentious, but it slept all of us, and it was on the water, and great family times. When we moved to Pittsburgh, the company suggested I move from Chicago to Pittsburgh. The big event in Pittsburgh was after church one Sunday evening. We went to this couple's home for a cup of coffee, and they had recently adopted a baby. So on the way home, I gave Mary the elbow and said, "Why don't we do that?" So we talked about it and said, "Yeah, why don't we do that?" So a week later, trotted down to the Pittsburgh Department of Family and Social Services and told them we were interested in adopting a child. They said, "Well, you already have 3 of them." Twins were born. Michelle was born in Washington, twins in Chicago. And we said, "Well, we like kids and we have room." Interesting, they said, "Would you be interested in taking a child who is more difficult to place?" And we said, "That's fine with us." They have an unusual situation in Pittsburgh in that they have a lot of residents from the Baltic or Balkans, Balkan countries, Armenia. You've heard of the starving Armenians. A lot of them went refugees. A lot of Armenians and so forth, and other of those Baltic countries which are religiously belong to the Orthodox Church. And, Orthodox Russians, Greeks, what have you. And in the Army, for example, we only had 3 religions. Everybody had a dog tag. You were supposed to wear in case they found you dead. They know, whether they put a star or a cross over your... You could be either Catholic, Protestant, or Jewish. The law in Pittsburgh at that time was that any woman placing a child for adoption, the agency had to follow the religious preference of the woman placing the child. And their problem in Pittsburgh was that little Armenian kids tended to have brown eyes and black hair, and the other two population groups tend to be looking for blue-eyed, blonde-haired kids. So he said, yeah, that doesn't make any difference to us. Turns out when we adopted David, we did because he was a year older and had health problems. But that was a great experience for the family too, and for the kids. Our kids at that time were, I don't know, 12, 13 years old, something like that. Yes. Two reasons. I agree with God. And He could have made us so that we would propagate some other way. You know, some mammals lay eggs without sex, and I don't know, anyway. But the good Lord decided to make us male and female, and that we would be united to each other in a myriad of ways, one of which was sexually, in order to populate the earth, be fruitful and multiply. The family is the basic social structure of society. John Paul II, affectionately known as J2P2, I think I read all of his what he called encyclicals, which are letters to the churches. And he had one encyclical where he dealt with the social structure of society, recognizing that the family is the basic social structure, and families to get together to form churches. And then there are auxiliary structures, such as political structures, but I won't go into the J2P2's theory, but it's interesting reading. But the other obvious reason is that the family is the way that the church is growing. My grandmother came from a family of 14. My mother came from a family of 8. My father, I think there were 10 of them. Things slowed down. I was one of 3. Right now in the United States, we're not replacing ourselves, and sadly that's just as true for the church as it is for society as a whole. Consumerism. People think kids are too expensive. They think, every kid needs his own bedroom, every kid needs to be dressed appropriately, yada, yada, yada. You would need a very good business plan. And starting a business is interesting. I tend to be the family banker. We adopted David in Pittsburgh, and we adopted Alex in Philadelphia. That was the most interesting thing we did in our marriage. But Easter Sunday, we'll see Alex again with his wife and a child. He's made great progress. And he is self-employed as a trucker. And a couple of weeks ago, I had another call from Alex Dad, I've got an opportunity to buy another tractor. I can hire somebody to drive it for me. All I would need from you would be, I think he said, $50,000. I look at those things as, typically with his background, he would not do well in a banker's office. But I'm not a banker, I'm his father. And if I lend him $50,000, and I was joking with him, and I said, Alex, you're going to pay it back? Oh yeah, Dad, I'll pay you back so much a month. I said, Alex, I'm having my 95th birthday. I don't have that many months left. But if I go to the celestial city and the truck isn't paid for, that'll come out of your share of the inheritance. My kids aren't going to get a huge inheritance. I'm not a great fan of that either, but my last almost 30 years, I owned a business. And I had a Christian business partner, which was very good. Neither of us were interested in making as much money as we could. And we had the business of providing actuarial and administrative services for corporate retirement plans. And we were in Lebanon, Pennsylvania. It was our principal office. And our principal market were employers who had Mennonite and Amish employees who would not participate in a 401k plan because of the way it was invested. I was the chief investment officer in the firm and worked very, very closely with the Mennonite community and grew to have great appreciation for them. They're also pacifists. But the notion of applying Christian principles to investments, that was always kind of interesting in dealing with corporate America. We would invest in companies that go astray. I recall at one time we had invested in a company called Kimberly-Clark. Toilet paper, Kleenex, Kotex, anything out of paper. And a lot of these employers would, if Kimberly-Clark was part of their equity portfolio, they would put annual reports in the employee cafeteria. So I got a call one day from this employer saying, Bob, we got a problem. In the Kimberly-Clark annual report, they talk about signing a contract with Liggett Myers to make cigarette papers. Tobacco was on the no-no list. So, I said, okay. So I gave a call to Kimberly-Clark, and I think it's either Houston or Dallas, and asked for an explanation of why they bought this. And you get the usual malarkey of adding shareholder value. And then I explained the problem of we were shareholders who took exception to buying tobacco because, as far as we could figure out, you're buying a product that kills people. And we Mennonites and Amish have a problem in terms of our Christian values. And now their immediate concern was that we wanted either to show up at the annual meeting, which they can't stop, although today they're going more to Zoom meetings, or that we would want to make a proposal to be included in the annual report to be voted on by the shareholders. So I said, no, I said, you know, we're not fighters, we'll just take our money and go someplace else. About 2.5 years later, I get a phone call. Mr. Heerdt, yeah, this is Mr. So-and-so from 𝐏𝐢𝐜𝐬. He said, I never forgot our conversation. We no longer are making cigarette papers for 𝐏𝐢𝐜𝐬. So you always had those. I did that with CVS when CVS was selling cigarettes. And I spoke there in Woonsocket, Rhode Island, speaking to their VP for investor relations about the problem of selling cancer drugs in the back of the store and cigarettes in the front. It was always the kind of business where the Christian principles that you live by were put to work. Because when you buy stock, you're an owner of the company. Okay? And as an owner of the company, you have some responsibility for what they do. Now we had the company that actually we owned, again, Christian management principles, the way we paid our employees, leave taking for family or illness, things of that. We tended to be very generous with the employees. Actually, we sold the business to Fulton Trust out of Lancaster some years ago, and Fulton Trust agreed to keep all of our employees. They would not reduce anyone's salary, and no, they would keep employees for at least 3 years because we felt we had a moral obligation to people who had worked for us. I mentioned I used to play squash with a guy from Temple using the Deuteronomy principle of redistributing everything every 50 years. Leaving an inheritance to your children in the Bible was usually an agricultural thing. In other words, I can think of the situation of the one guy who only had daughters, not sons, and the daughters coming and saying, hey, Dad, how about us? And he's saying, okay, I'll leave the inheritance to the daughters. Because in an agrarian society, most people, wealth was simply a matter of, if you inherited anything, it was land. So I don't think that verse refers to accumulating as many of Caesar's coins as you can lay your hands on. I like the form of government that recognizes the individual or the family as the key member of society, and that those individuals can temporarily transfer power or authority to others. But the state ultimately serves its citizens, not the other way around. No. You get St. Paul's attitude towards the state. You know, you honor the king, and the king he was referring to was not the Pope. You know, if you were to honor Caesar, because his argument was that authority structures ultimately in society come from God. But because they are practiced by men, even though they're ordained by God, they are fraught with all sorts of problems. But I think Paul is saying, hey, no big deal. Deal with the problem. I'll back up and say when I had my first daughter, I had the feeling of, what have we done? Completely changed our lives, how we spent our time. Everything got centered around this little kid. And years later, when that little kid had a kid, I was very, very pleased. Again, particularly pleased with Christian children who would raise those children in a Christ-like way. And then we had 12 grandchildren. And then we had 16 great-grandchildren. So there's 50 of us all together, and that takes care of the inheritance. If you're going to divide it by 50, nobody gets much anyway. Participation in the church, family vacations. In July, Mary and I are going to Harvey Cedars, and we extended an invitation to everybody else to come as well, and we would pay for it, hoping they don't all come. I'm a strong believer in Christian education. Anybody who sends a child to a Christian school gets so many $1,000s a year. Christmas, we celebrate by everybody in the family gets 2 goats and 2 chickens. A reminder of the true meaning of Christmas. One of the better things I did after we had 3 kids in college for the same time for 3 years. It strained the budget. And after they got out, we started accumulating money. I had bought a few securities that had significantly appreciated, and I used to serve on the board of an outfit called Bethany Christian Services, and we met quarterly in Grand Rapids, Michigan. One of the other board members was 𝐏𝐢𝐜𝐿, who had sold his business to, I think it was Duke Oil in the Carolinas, for many, many, many millions of dollars. And we used to have breakfast before the meetings, and the problem, what do you do with all the money? And he finally set up a family foundation. And that was a stimulus for me when we started accumulating money. I tend to take very seriously the title that Jesus gave to the guy who decided to build another barn, or his comments about the camel getting through the eye of the needle. So I don't want to die rich. So we set up a family foundation, and its objectives were keeping riches down. We set that up in '95. This was before they had things called donor-advised funds that your family has. And with a charitable foundation at that time, and ours is a private family foundation, you have to give away a percentage of your principal every year, which we have done every year, and every year I've put the principal back in from my other resources. It's not a big fund, a couple $1 million, but what it does, I have appointed some of my children as trustees, and every year a letter goes out to the kids, to everybody in the family, listing where we have made our grants this year and asking any of them to keep an eye on places where we can make a grant, to teach generosity to succeeding generations. And that has worked reasonably well. I mean, when I first set it up, I called our older kids together and said, I got great news for your inheritance. I used to manage the retirement assets. You ever heard of the Plymouth Brothers? They used to have a church on Church Road behind the Episcopal Church. Plymouth Brethren are similar to Quakers. They have no clergy. We've attended their services. They have 2 services on Sunday morning. One anybody can come to. And the second one, you have to be a Christian to be admitted. And if you're not they don't have church membership. If you show up often enough, they consider you a church member. That coincides with my view of church membership. Nothing biblical about it, but anyway. This is a church. Every Sunday I say I believe in one holy, Catholic, and Apostolic Church. That's the one I belong to.
I love that.
I haven't had that much nonprofit experience. I spent, I don't know, about a dozen years on Bethany's board, and then I spent, I think it was 9 years as the executive VP of Covenant College's board, and then numerous church sessions. The Plymouth Brethren have a slogan from, I think it's Colossians, namely where Paul says, it's required of a steward that he be found faithful. And so they called their foundation the Stewardship Foundation. Yeah, like our family charitable trust. I'm not interested in, 3 generations from now supporting the Philadelphia Orchestra or saving seals or something of that nature. So the trust says that successive trustees are elected by the remaining trustees, and they must add a professing Christian as a trustee. And we only make grants to meet the health, educational, and social needs of poor children where those needs are met in Christ's name. I've known Mary for 75 years. Let me give you my definition of faithfulness in a marriage. Not faithfulness, but love. Because I did make a commitment to love her until death do our part. Biblical love is not warm fuzzies. That's not to say that warm fuzzies don't accompany love. But the essence of love is an imitation of divine love. For God so loved the world that he gave. Christ gave himself. In other words, love is fundamentally giving oneself to another. So that my pledge to Mary is that I give myself to her. The second thing about faithfulness, we often say the Lord's Prayer together. If you were in an Anglican church, you would say, "Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us." That to me is one of the more sobering statements in the Bible. After the disciples asked Jesus how to pray, he gave them the Lord's Prayer, and then as a postscript, reminded them that forgiveness was determined by how you forgive. So that I've always been confident there's nothing I could do that Mary wouldn't forgive me, or vice versa. Just as there's nothing I can do that Christ wouldn't forgive me. Doesn't mean I can do anything in my marriage, but it does mean that upon my repentance I'm forgiven. Very comfortable. You run into people every once in a while, have marriage difficulties and beat a bath to I don't know how many counselors' doors and so forth. And we've never had counseling. We've talked numerous times about what is love and what is forgiveness. Now, what is true of, which is what makes marriage indissoluble, the other thing I think is lifestyle. I mean, your kids can't help but watch you. How you spend your time, how you spend your money, what are the books you're always passing over to them, and things of that nature. One gets a slightly different perspective with age. Friday I start 95. Mary is 10 months behind me. We both look at each other and say, we ain't gonna be around much longer. Last night I was talking to a friend, this guy's 103, but Not many of us make it. And so, you know, we don't expect to be around much longer, and that does temper your thinking. You know, things aren't as important to us as they were 50 years ago. And the celestial city keeps looking better. I am, around this place, part of what's called the hospice team. Familiar with hospice care? I'm a great fan of it. I get assigned hospice patients to visit on a regular basis, help them face their death and so forth. Which obviously makes me think of my own, but it's been a, you know, people say, why do you do that? And I said, well, I meet two kinds of people. Some are in absolute denial. Some who are eager to wait simply to get it over with, but some who have a blessed hope. And surprising how many are in that last category. We used to read the Pilgrim's Progress to our kids all the time. When Pilgrim gets to Beulah Land and looks at the celestial city, yeah, looks better all the time. I had physical therapy this morning. A therapist, you know, trying to put this leg behind this shoulder, and, you know, I said, come on, Steve, you know, I'm not going to be around that long. Don't make a mess out of me, you know. His objective is to get me walking without the walker again, so. But if that happens, okay. If it doesn't happen, that's okay. The peace that passes understanding. Yeah, Christ expressed, you know, my peace I leave with you. Peace, I think, is very closely related to confidence. You know, don't worry about anything. He's in control.